The repair invoice sitting on the conference table listed $3 million, 11 engineers, and 43 days of failed attempts. The car was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, midnight black, $260,000 when it left the factory floor. The personal vehicle of a man who had built his career on the belief that the right amount of money, applied by the right number of credentialed people, could solve any problem that existed. It had not moved under its own power in 6 weeks. The man who fixed it arrived on a Tuesday morning in a jacket with a frayed left cuff, carrying a canvas bag that weighed less than 8 pounds. Inside it was a wire stripper, a voltage meter, a small coil of copper wire, and a single paperclip he had picked up from the floor of a junkyard 3 days earlier without knowing yet exactly why he needed it. He was not a Rolls-Royce certified technician, he had once been, until the day he submitted a report that told the truth about something the company had already decided not to hear. He had a 7-year-old son named Marcus who had packed his lunch that morning and told him not to forget to eat it. He fixed the car in 4 hours. What he found inside that Phantom was not a mystery, it never had been. It had been a decision, made in a boardroom, by people who understood the cost of being wrong and had calculated, correctly, that most people would never look closely enough to find it. Stay with this story until the very last word, because what happens in the final 10 minutes will change the way you think about expertise, institutions, and the price of telling the truth before anyone is ready to hear it. The Rolls-Royce regional headquarters for the eastern United States occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a glass building in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. The kind of address that existed to confirm what the people inside it already believed about themselves. The carpets were deep gray. The reception desk was a Venetian letter, or a single slab of white marble. The elevator opened directly into a lobby where a full-size Phantom sat on a raised platform behind glass, rotating slowly on a motorized base, catching the light from 3 directions at once in a way that made it look less like a vehicle and more like an argument about what money was capable of producing. Edward Calloway was the regional chief executive, 56 years old, and had occupied his position for 9 years without ever being seriously wrong about anything in a way that anyone with authority over him had noticed or cared to document. He was not a cruel man in the obvious sense of the word. He was the more efficient kind of difficult, the kind that operated through institutional confidence rather than personal malice, who had learned that dismissing people cleanly and early was more effective than engaging with them at length. His personal Rolls-Royce Phantom had developed its fault on a Thursday evening 6 weeks earlier, during a 40-minute drive from the office to a client dinner. The car had not stalled. It had not made a sound it should not have. It had not given any indication of distress that a passenger would have noticed from the back seat. What it had done was lose all primary electrical output to its central management system in a pattern so smooth and so complete that the onboard diagnostics had registered nothing abnormal at all. The car simply stopped responding to itself. The drive assist system disengaged. The adaptive suspension locked into its default position, the climate control froze at its last setting, the instrument display went dark without triggering a single warning light, and then a quarter mile from the restaurant, the engine management system quietly declined to maintain ignition, and the Phantom rolled to a stop against a curb on a street in Buckhead, with the kind of silent dignity that only very expensive things manage when they fail. Edward Calloway had taken a car service to dinner and had not mentioned the incident to his guests. He had mentioned it to his assistant at 7 the following morning, in a tone that made the conversation brief and the timeline clear. The first engineering team arrived from Rolls-Royce's North American Technical Center in New Jersey within 72 hours. 3 senior technicians, factory certified, carrying diagnostic equipment that had cost more than the annual operating budget of most independent garages. They spent King Festa 8 days on the car. Their report identified no fault in any measurable system, every component tested within specification, every module responded correctly when queried individually. The electrical architecture of the car appeared, by every available metric, to be entirely sound. The car still would not replicate the failure under testing conditions. A second team arrived from the United Kingdom. 4 engineers this time, including a specialist in Rolls-Royce's Ghost and Phantom electrical platform who had been involved in the original system design. 14 days, no fault found, no replication of the failure achieved. A third engagement brought in an independent firm from Munich, at Edward Callaway's personal instruction, the kind of firm that charged by the hour at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One says, not at the Glaffer at a rate that required a separate budget authorization. One staffed by 4 engineers whose collective credentials filled 2 pages of a formal introduction document. 3 weeks. The same result. The car had failed once, though the once nation letter, completely without warning, without leaving a trace, and had not failed again since. By the 43rd day the total expenditure had crossed $3 million. The car sat in a climate-controlled private bay at an authorized Atlanta dealership, connected to diagnostic equipment on 3 separate ports, monitored remotely from 2 locations, and as silent and unhelpful as it had been on the night it stopped. Edward Callaway read the 3rd team's final report on a Monday morning, set it beside his coffee, and looked at it for a long time without touching it again. Then he called his assistant and said he wanted a name, not a team, a name. One person who understood this specific platform in a way that the last 11 engineers apparently did not. His assistant made 4 calls before she found one. Daniel Reeves was 39 years old and operated a one-man automotive service and diagnostic shop out of a converted warehouse space in East Point, a neighborhood 12 miles, Friedel-Balmlesen Point, a more beat of Orismace, south of downtown Atlanta that had not yet been discovered by the kind of development that would have eventually priced him out of it. The shop had no sign above the door, only a number. His clients found him the way his clients had always found him, through one person telling another person quietly that if you had a problem nobody else could solve. No, the one person telling another person quietly that if you had a problem nobody else could solve. No, there was a man in East Point who would look at the actual car rather than the data the car produced about itself. He had spent 7 years at Rolls-Royce's North American Technical Division before his employment ended in a way that the official record described as a mutual separation following a restructuring of the Diagnostic Assessment Department. What had actually happened was a single report filed in the spring of Daniel's 7th year, a 12-page technical document he had submitted to his department director after identifying a recurring pattern across 14 vehicles from a specific production window. A pattern in the bisevielinkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel important, and not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel inkennensedeseng, not at the glass walls that once made him feel interaction between the central electrical management module and the secondary power distribution relay that sat behind the dashboard's lower left panel. The pattern was subtle. It did not appear under standard diagnostic conditions. It appeared only under a specific combination of ambient temperature, sustained electrical load, and the particular vibration frequency generated by the vehicle traveling at highway speed on certain road surfaces. Under those conditions, a microscopic variance in the MAT, not at the glass condition, relays contact bridge, within manufacturing tolerance and technically compliant with every quality specification the car had been built to, could produce a complete and temporary loss of communication between the central management module and every downstream system it supervised. The failure left no code, no trace, no indication it had ever occurred. Daniel had documented it across 14 vehicles. He had proposed a fix so simple it had made his department director smile in the wrong way. Before he had finished explaining it, a single wire reroute and a contact bridge correction that could be performed in under 2 hours and cost less than the coffee the engineering team had consumed during their first review meeting. His director had thanked him for his thoroughness. The report had been filed and not circulated. Months later, Daniel Reeves had been informed that his position was being eliminated as part of a broader restructuring and that the company wished him well in his Bielnivis not at the Glafton wished him well in his Bielnivis future endeavors. He had taken the canvas bag from his locker, driven to East Point, and started over. That had been 7 years ago. His son Marcus had been born 4 months after the separation. His wife Elena had died of complications following surgery 2 years after that, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in a hospital room that Daniel had not left for 31 hours before and did not leave for 6 hours after. He had gone back to work the following Monday because Marcus needed was immediately what he can nada farmes, van dimmel nunders I sunchasi mevsio mioneifer. He had gone back to work the following Monday because Marcus needed what he can nada farmes, than mioneifer, consistency more than his father needed time, and because the work was the one thing Daniel had always known how to do without being told. On the Tuesday morning this story begins, Marcus had woken early, made himself cereal, packed his father's lunch in a brown paper bag with the words "A at this" written on it in blue marker, and told Daniel at the door not to forget his voltage meter. Daniel checked his canvas bag. The voltage meter was already in it. He told Marcus he would be back before dinner. Marcus told him he already knew that. The authorized dealership where the Phantom was being held was a 20-minute drive from East Point on a clear morning. Daniel arrived at 8:40, parked his truck beside a row of vehicles that collectively cost more than his building, and checked in at the service desk with the unhurried manner of a man who had been in rooms like this one for long enough to stop being impressed by them. The service manager who walked him back to the private bay Boskov was named Glenn. A careful, quietly competent man in his 40s who had watched 3 separate engineering teams work on this car and had formed opinions he had kept entirely to himself throughout. He unlocked the bay, told Daniel he had full access to everything the previous teams had left connected, and handed him a folder containing all 3 diagnostic reports. Daniel thanked him, set the folder on the workbench without opening it, and looked at the car. He walked around it once slowly, and hands in his jacket pockets. Then he crouched at the front left wheel arch and looked at the underside of the sill for 40 seconds. Then he stood and walked to the rear of the vehicle and looked at the exhaust configuration. Then he opened the driver's door and sat in the seat without starting the car, resting his hands on the steering wheel, and looked at the dashboard for a long time. Glenn watched from the bay doorway without saying anything, in the way of a man who had learned that watching someone who knew what they were doing was more useful than interrupting them. After 6 minutes, Daniel got out of the car, opened his canvas bag and removed his voltage meter. He did not open the folder on the workbench. He would not open it at all. He began at the central management module, running a baseline voltage check across each distribution circuit in sequence. Not because he expected to find the fault there, he did not, but because he wanted to feel the electrical architecture of this specific FAR. The way a person runs a hand along a wall in the dark, not to find the light switch immediately, but to understand the shape of the room first. The readings were clean, entirely within specification, exactly as all 3 previous teams had documented. He moved to the secondary circuits, still clean. He moved to the tertiary relay network and crouched beside the lower dashboard panel on the driver's side, the panel that sat below and behind the main instrument cluster, accessible only by removing a trim section that required 3 specific tools and the knowledge that it existed in the first place. The previous teams had accessed this panel. Their documentation confirmed it. They had measured the relay, confirmed its output was within tolerance, and moved on. Daniel did not measure the relay first. He looked at it. Specifically, he looked at the contact bridge, a component approximately the size of a paperclip. its function to maintain continuous, electrical contact between 2 points in the relay's internal circuit under all operating conditions. He looked at it under his inspection light for 90 seconds. Once is nation important, and not a thing for Zekels under Thicalace. Then he sat back on his heels and was still for a moment. The contact bridge was within specification, visually, dimensionally, by every measure that any instrument in the bay was capable of applying, but Daniel had seen this before. He had documented it across 14 vehicles 7 years ago. He knew what this particular component, a scale component, what he already moaned, looked like when it was about to fail in the specific way it failed. Not catastrophically, not visibly, but thermally, under sustained heat and vibration, at a specific combination of conditions that a static diagnostic bay could not replicate. The bridge would expand fractionally. The contact would open by a margin too small to measure at rest. The entire management system would lose its reference signal for between 3 and 9 seconds before thermal contraction restored the contact in the phase. Once you see is what if Tiashin, 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 once you see is what Nisem rebooted as though nothing had occurred, no code, no trace, no indication it had ever happened, except that the car would be found on the side of a road in Buckhead with a very expensive and very embarrassed man standing beside it. He reached into his canvas bag and removed the paperclip. Glenn appeared at the bay door at 11:45 with 2 coffees and the expression of a man who had been waiting for something to happen and was beginning to suspect it already had. Daniel was lying on his back beneath the dashboard, working in the space behind the lower trim panel with a wire stripper and a short length of copper wire from his bag. Glenn set 1 coffee on the workbench and asked how it was going. Daniel said he would be finished in about an hour. Glenn looked at the canvas bag on the floor, at the wire stripper, at the paperclip sitting in a small tray beside the bag. He asked what the fix was. Daniel told him, the relay contact bridge, the thermal expansion variance, the wire reroute that bypassed the failure point and maintained the management system's reference signal under all operating conditions, the paperclip serving as a contact stabilizer, holding the bridge geometry at the corrected angle while the wire reroute carried the load. Glenn asked how much the parts cost. Daniel said under $2. Glenn picked up his coffee, looked at the car and said nothing else for a long time. Daniel started the Phantom at 12:53. The management system, the by the motorware 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 management system, initialized completely. Every module reported online. Every circuit showed normal. The instrument display came up clean, all systems present, all functions responsive. He drove it out of the bay and onto the dealership's test loop, a half-mile circuit around the facility's perimeter that the service team used for post-repair verification. He drove it 6 times. On the 3rd circuit he pushed the speed to the point where the road surface and the vehicle's own resonance frequency would have combined to produce exactly the thermal and vibrational conditions his report had identified 7 years earlier. The management system held. He drove it 3 more times, varying the speed, the load, the climate control settings, and the audio system draw, cycling every electrical consumer in the vehicle simultaneously on the 5th circuit to maximize the load on the distribution relay. The management system held every time. He seoriven da the megeren spolvivenata resikstolpa maltent and nund, ran a full system read, 0 faults, 0 stored codes, 0 anomalies across every system the car contained. He disconnected the equipment, wiped the driver's seat with a cloth from his bag, and called Glenn. He told him it was done. Glenn came into the bay, looked at the diagnostic screen, looked at the car, and sat down on the stool beside the workbench for a moment, in the way of a man processing the distance between $3 million and $2 worth of wire and a paperclip. Then he was fear adjust and feel important. Maninding Fraser Kemble Duffnaning Kementening. Called upstairs. Edward Calloway arrived at the dealership at 2:15 in a car service vehicle, the same way he had been arriving everywhere for 6 weeks. He walked into the bay in a suit that had not been selected for a service department visit, looked at the Phantom, looked at Daniel, and looked at Glenn in a sequence that carried the specific weight of a man who had spent 6 weeks being told his problem was unsolvable and was not yet certain how to hold the information that it had not been.
Glenn told him the car was repaired. Full system function confirmed. 43 miles of test driving across varied conditions without a single fault. Edward looked at Daniel.
He asked who he was. Daniel told him his name. Edward looked at him for a moment longer than the answer required. Then he asked which firm he was from. Daniel said he was not from a firm. He had his own shop in East Point. Edward's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a calculation is being revised if a register lovertum 4 against incoming information that does not fit the original model. He asked what the repair had involved. Daniel told him. The relay, the contact bridge, the thermal variance, the wire reroute, the paperclip. Edward looked at the canvas bag on the workbench, at the wire stripper, at the small tray where the original contact bridge now sat beside a 2-inch length of copper wire. He asked how much it had cost. Daniel said the materials were under $2. He said his labor rate was monsterschen. 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 He said his labor $85 an hour, and he had been in the building for a little over 5 hours. Edward Calloway stood in the bay of his authorized dealership, in front of his repaired Rolls-Royce Phantom, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with the numbers Daniel had just given him. He asked how Daniel had known where to look. Daniel looked at him steadily and said he had seen this before. Edward said that was not a complete answer. Daniel said he knew. What happened in the next 20 minutes, Oz office, happened quietly, in the way that the most significant conversations tend to happen, without raised voices, without theatrics, without any of the furniture of confrontation that people use when they need the moment to feel larger than they are capable of making it on their own. Daniel told him about the report, the 14 vehicles, the 12 pages, the spring of his 7th year at the company, the director who had thanked him for his thoroughness and filed the document somewhere it would not be found by anyone looking for it. He told him about the contact bridge variance, about the specific combination of conditions required to trigger it, about the fact that the fault existed in every vehicle from that production window. Not just the Phantom in this bay, but in every car built during that period that was still on the road. He did not tell him this with anger. He told him the way he told anyone anything about a car, with the flat, unhurried precision of a man conveying facts about a physical object to someone who needed to understand them. Edward Calloway listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, the bay was quiet enough that the climate control unit cycling on the far wall was the loudest thing in the room. Edward looked at the Phantom for a long time. Then he asked how many vehicles were in the affected production window. Daniel said he did not know the current number. He said 7 years ago it had been several thousand. Edward said nothing. Daniel picked up with the old mesos. 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 His canvas bag is set the wire stripper and voltage meter back inside it, and zipped it closed. He left the original contact bridge in the small tray on the workbench. He did not take the paperclip back. Edward Calloway did not call his assistant when he left the dealership. He drove the Phantom himself for the first time in 6 weeks, taking the long route back through Buckhead, past the curb where the car had stopped on the night this had all begun. He drove it at highway speed on the connector, Leis Faso Isfiriklantizadas, Eiferwisig the Domingenendes and des Amanching. Feeling the ride, listening to the engine, letting the car's systems work around him in the particular way this specific class of vehicle was engineered to feel. It resolved the way it was built to drive, completely, without hesitation or fault. He sat in his office for 2 hours that afternoon without scheduling anything. What he was doing, in the privacy of a room where no one could observe him doing it, was sitting with the full weight of a thing he had not been responsible for creating but had inherited the consequences of, a report filed and buried before his tenure. A man's career ended for telling the truth about it, a fault existing in thousands of vehicles currently on roads across the country known to no one with the authority to address it. He had not buried the report, he had not fired Daniel Reeves, but he was sitting in the chair of the institution that had done both. By the following morning, he had made 3 decisions. The first was a complete production window audit. Every vehicle from the affected build period currently registered in the North American market to be identified, contacted, and brought in for inspection and repair at no cost to the owner. The repair itself, a wire reroute and contact bridge correction, would take under 2 hours per vehicle. The parts cost per car would not exceed $3. The second was a formal internal review of the original report, its filing, its suppression, and the sequence of decisions that had followed it. He submitted the request to the company's internal legal and compliance office in writing, under his own name, without routing it through anyone else first. The third decision he made in a phone call he placed himself, without asking his assistant to arrange it. Daniel was in his shop when the call came through, replacing a brake master cylinder on a 10-year-old sedan whose owner had been putting it off for 2 months longer than she should have. Marcus was at school. The radio was on low. The afternoon light came through the high windows of the warehouse in long flat panels that crossed the concrete floor and reached the car from the left side. Edward told him what he had decided. He told him about the audit, the review, and what he intended to recommend to the company's North American leadership regarding the report that had been filed and buried 7 years earlier. He said he could not undo what had been done, not as one do what he for. He said he understood that clearly, and was not going to pretend, otherwise. Then he said the company owed Daniel Reeves a formal acknowledgement that the report he had submitted had been correct, that the action taken against him following its submission had been unjust, and that his name should be attached to the repair protocol that would now be applied across the entire affected fleet, because it was his repair. It had always been his repair. Daniel set down his wrench and sat on the edge of the lift platform. He did not speak for a moment. Then he asked of his fear, exhaustion, and the fragile hope of a father who had just gambled everything for the once made him feel important, and not at the glass walls that once made him feel important, and not at the glass walls that once made him feel important, and not at the glass walls that once made him feel important. One question. He asked whether the people who currently owned the affected vehicles would be contacted before any further failures occurred. Edward said yes, that was the first thing that had already been set in motion that morning. Daniel said then that was what mattered. He said he appreciated the call. He picked up his wrench and went back to the brake cylinder. The audit identified 4,031 vehicles in the affected production window currently registered across the United States and Canada. Of those, 219 had experienced unexplained electrical management failures that had been logged by authorized dealers and closed without resolution. The same failure, in the same component, producing the same untraceable fault pattern that Daniel had documented across 14 cars 7 years before anyone with authority had been willing to look at the paper he had written about it. Every one of those owners had been told their vehicle's systems were operating within specification. Every one of them was now contacted and offered a complimentary inspection and repair. The repair protocol bore Daniel Reeves's name in the internal documentation. A note as a footnote, as the author. The formal acknowledgement from Rolls-Royce North America arrived at Daniel's shop 6 weeks after the phone call, on an envelope that was unremarkable from the outside and contained 3 pages that said in the careful, precise language of institutional acknowledgement that he had been right, that what had been done to him had been wrong, and that the company was sorry. He read all 3 pages standing at his workbench, then he folded them along their original creases and put them in the drawer where he kept documents that mattered. Not on the wall. Not framed. In the drawer. The way a person keeps something that confirmed what they already knew but had spent 7 years waiting to have acknowledged by someone else. Edward Calloway offered Daniel a consulting offer at an MSIRE's position, a formal arrangement to serve as an independent technical advisor on electrical platform issues across the North American fleet. Daniel accepted on one condition. He said the work had to be done from East Point. He said he was not moving his shop. He was not relocating. He was not going back into a building with a marble reception desk and a rotating phantom behind glass. He said he had a son who knew where to find him at the end of every day, and that was not a thing he was willing to changes. Edward said East Point was fine. Daniel said then they had a deal. On the Friday evening after the acknowledgement letter arrived, Daniel picked Marcus up from school at the regular time, stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and made dinner in the kitchen of their apartment, the same way he made dinner every Friday. With the radio on and Marcus sitting at the counter doing homework and occasionally asking questions that had nothing to do with homework. Marcus asked what was in the onsteds SPHNITHAMD, and what the befeels that had come to the shop. Daniel said it was a letter from a company he used to work for. Marcus asked if it was good news or bad news. Daniel thought about that for a moment, the way he thought about questions that deserved a real answer. He said it was the truth. He said sometimes the truth arrived later than it should, but that did not make it worth any less when it finally came. Marcus considered this with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old who was not entirely sure he fears it speta faced, understood but was certain his father meant it. Then he asked what was for dinner. Daniel told him. Marcus said that was acceptable and went back to his homework. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the Atlanta evening light was going flat over the rooftops of East Point, the same neighborhood Daniel had driven to 7 years ago with a canvas bag and nothing else, and had stayed in because it was where the work was and the work was what he knew how to do. The paperclip was still in the Fazia, Niferdil. Phantom, he had not asked for it back. It was a 2-cent piece of bent wire holding a contact bridge at the correct angle in a $260,000 car, and it had done what $3 million and 11 engineers had not. Not because it was remarkable, but because the man who placed it there had been looking at the actual problem for 7 years before anyone gave him permission to fix it. The drawer with the letter in it was closed. The radio was on. Marcus was doing his menus, homework, and Daniel Reeves was making dinner. If stories about the kind of knowledge that cannot be fired, cannot be buried, and cannot be replaced by any budget large enough to avoid looking at the truth, the Folsmation Niverection, Nies Heinenges, if those are the stories that stay with you, stay close to this channel, because there are more of them, and they are all true in the ways that matter most.